morning. Good morning. Last week was Thanksgiving in the United States, and although my wife and I live in Switzerland, we were in Silicon Valley, where my daughter lives, for the holiday. And I was preparing for this panel. I hope it shows. And I was mentioning to a very close family member that we were going to discuss how the state creates value and the choices that might be made. And this family member, who's a venture capitalist in the Valley, said to me, "That's easy." He said, "It'll be a short panel. The message is stay out of the way." So I hope it's more than that. I hope that what we come out of this is concluding that it's more than that. But certainly, whatever we conclude, we have an amazing panel here. I'm going to briefly introduce people. I've never said this before, but I think that you would do yourself a service to look up the biographies of each of our panel members, because they come from very diverse backgrounds and they've done great things. And I think it's really, I'm very excited to be up here with them. So let me start with Hermann Hauser. Hermann is the co-founder of Amadeus Capital Partners, but he's also the co-founder of Acorn. You were present at the beginning of the digital age. Out of that came ARM and risk operating systems, and just set the tone for so much of the things that we do today. He then became VP of R&D for Olivetti, so he has both serial entrepreneur experience, big company experience as well. Thomas Sattelberger, sitting to Hermann's left, is a real politician. So we're going to talk about the state. He's a member of the German Bundestag. He is a former executive board member at Daimler-Benz, at Lufthansa, at Continental, and he was on my board at CEIBS in Shanghai. It's good to have you back. Next to Thomas is Mariana Mazzucato. Close? Okay, reasonably close. One of the most exciting young economists, I think, on the scene today. She is a professor at the University College of London, chair of the Innovation and Public Value Center there, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's just published a book called The Value of Everything, Making and Taking the Global Economy. It's one of those books, when I read it, I said, I wish I had written this. It's a great book. And I wish I was smart enough to have write it, much less do it. And she's also published a really interesting report for the European Commission on mission-oriented innovation. To her left is Martin Wolf, associate editor and chief economics commentator for the Financial Times. Needs no introduction. He has won every award imaginable for journalism. He's written a great book on, among others, several books, but on how globalization works, which is one of my favorite. He's one of Foreign Policy's top 100 global thinkers. The list goes on and on and on. And to Martin's left is Andrew Keen. Andrew is I think an agent provocateur. He is on the scene in Silicon Valley. He has provocative views about what's going on there and its implications for our democracy. He's written another book that I wish I had written called Fix the Future, and he talks about how our present era is somewhere in between what the 20th century did and did it badly, and what the 21st century seems unable to do. So in his words, the future is broken and it needs to be fixed. So I think we have the makings of a great discussion about how the state adds value. I'm going to ask Hermann to begin.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a great pleasure to be here in Vienna, the city of my birth, although I've lived in England for a very long time now. What I want to do today to show you that we live in a most unusual period of that mankind is going through, because until now, our developments, the way we lived, our future was completely determined by evolution. And what is happening is that evolution is being replaced by design. I won't use the word intelligent design because that has an unfortunate flavor. The reason why this is happening, why evolution is actually is about to come to an end and design takes over and will make us the new gods, according to Yuval Harari. It will give us incredible powers for good, but also incredible powers to screw up. And it's these technology disruptions and the market failure that I want to talk to you about today. In my opinion, there are 4 fundamental disruptive technologies that will change our lives within the next 5 to 10 years, not the next 20 to 30 years. It's 5 to 10 years. It's very close. So the first one, and I'm sure all of you have heard about the consequences of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the first big revolution that will really touch everybody is robot taxis, these autonomous cars. I learn about these technologies through my investments. So I'll list one of these investments for each of the disruptions. This one is 5AI, which hopefully will be the first robotaxi in European cities. And because I'm a venture capitalist now after being a serial entrepreneur and a researcher, this gives me an opportunity to understand these technological changes right at the cutting edge, because these companies are as close to that you can get to with the consequences of these new technology. The second is blockchain and smart contracts, which leads to process automation in finance and industry. The third is synthetic biology, potentially the most beneficial of these technology disruptions for our health and for our pharma. And I've got an investment in a company called Evonetics, which is gene synthesis. And last but not least, quantum computing, which for the first time will allow us to build quantum systems. But again, it's very dangerous because of the code cracking that I'll come on to in a moment. So AI is one of those technologies where Europe has been leading, but the US and China is catching up. And I'll tell you more about GraphCore, a company that might produce the European microprocessor of choice for machine learning. It depends on big data, but big data is owned by big companies. GDPR helps, but the key thing to using a data is legitimately is to be clear about the purpose that data is used for. And if companies get too big, you need to break them up. So AI and machine learning allows for the design of complex systems. Blockchain and smart contracts, the distributed ledger technology, has been tainted by Bitcoin and the fraudulent ICOs. But with KYC, know your own customer, and anti-money laundering being automated, I think it will be a phenomenal new technology that allows us to revolutionize the global payment system, real estate with partial ownership, and insurance. And my play in this is a little company in Britain called BlockClaim. And this will allow us to design automated business executions. The third is synthetic biology. As I said, potentially the most dangerous because it gives us control over biology, but also the most beneficial because it can deal with 8,000 of our monogenetic diseases, and there's a chance of eradicating them. So how good can it get? But it needs very level-headed regulation, as indeed the Embryonic Research Council in the UK has shown how you can strike the right balance between being permissive enough for people to do research on embryos for the benefit of healthcare, but at the same time be very careful about taking the public with you. If you ever want to read a book about the consequences of synthetic biology, I can recommend Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark, who is a cosmologist in Boston. And the reason why I called it Life 3.0 is because Life 1.0 is the nematode worm where both the hardware of the worm and its behavior were completely determined by evolution. Life 2.0 is us, where the hardware is still determined by evolution, but the software is determined by us because we teach our children how to speak. We gave them a lot of our culture. Life 3.0 is when we finally take control of our hardware as well through synthetic technology. So synthetic biology is no less but taking control of biology and making it designable. Quantum computing is all about qubits. It's potentially an exponential increase in performance of computing. It's the continuation of Moore's law, which has come to an end. There is one company called Quantum, it's one of my investments, which has the ambition of producing 1 million qubits by 2023. If he succeeds, all the codes that we have at the moment to keep things secret will be crackable. Europe was in the lead, but the US and China are really becoming very dangerous competitors, and China in particular is about to overtake us in this field as well. So the role of government. This is all about the race to the top, is how we can translate our superiority in the EU that we still have on the research side. Our universities are some of the best in the world. But our ability to translate this lead that we have in research into successful companies has been lagging behind the US and now also China. And let's not forget that the basic research, which is one of the roles of government, is now sometimes done in companies. Arguably, DeepMind, a division of Google in London, is one of the leading AI companies in the world. And the same thing is true with quantum computers at IBM, at Microsoft, and at Google. So the government should pump prime things, and I'm chair of the European Innovation Council, which provides splendid support with grants, loans, and equity. And equity is equally important to crowd in the market, and it's one of the key roles that government should play, and bring more venture finance into Europe, because at the moment it's only 1/5 of the US. Which brings me to my concluding slide, that AI and ML moves from evolution to design of complex systems. The blockchain will design business automation. Synthetic biology will design biology, and quantum computers will, for the first time in the history of mankind, allow us to design quantum systems. The key message I have for you as a passionate European living in the Brexit UK is that we need to double up in our investments on areas where we lead. And in some of these areas that I talked about, we are actually leading. But we're falling behind because we're not putting enough money behind the fantastic research base that we have to translate it into successful companies. And my last point is about the role of government. And as Bill said at the beginning, VCs normally are very much against regulation, so it's very much, I'm surprising myself that I'm calling for more regulation in these technologies, and the role of government being a catalyst. All this has to do with choosing the right goals. That's why I'm wearing my 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN with such pride, because I think it is the harmonization of goals between nations and eventually also between the human goals and the AI goals that is the main problem that we have got to solve over the next few decades. Thank you very much.
Hermann, thank you. So, a long way away from stay out of the way, but double up and pump priming. That's quite a recommendation. Thomas, you're an active politician. Could you give us your perspective?
Yeah, Bill, probably I have been asked to join the panel not because I'm a politician, but because I was 40 years in business and I was now changing sides from the corporate world to politics, and so to say a lateral entrant, not a career politician. And I joined politics not because the German state was liberating innovation and economy and social innovation, but because the German state was strangling not only business but innovation. And getting involved a little bit in your work of the entrepreneurial state, which has a view more or less on the US in those times. I also reflected the German model and came up with my first reflection. The more social the market economy, the more the state is an agent of social innovation, vice versa. The more the state is an agent of social innovation, the more social is the market economy. Historically, you can see that in the early investment in our educational system in the 19th century, health insurance, social protection, and co-determination schemes, already in the Weimar Republic. But by more of the same, more of the good, the resources and the mindsets are lacking for technological innovation. And you can see that very clearly in my own country. On the other hand, the US model, the more entrepreneurial, the more deregulated the market economy, the more the state is an agent of technological innovation, assuming, besides military and defense reasonings, that innovation bridges the gap to commercialization, to growth, and to job creation. But by more of the same, the resources and the mindset are lacking for social innovation and preventing social divide. Scandinavian nations, especially Sweden, still seems to be able to balance social innovation path and the technological innovation path. So the value creation of the state seems, from my first hypothesis, to be dependent or restricted by the hidden beliefs about market economy and its DNA. Let me illustrate that on two different innovation approaches. In the US, in the pre-entrepreneurial phase, the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, is investing in many pioneering technologies, such as speech recognition, autonomous systems, the internet, and the GPS. And only after those new technological visions became clearer, there has been investments of startups and venture capitalists coming into action. Now, I promoted about 6 months ago, so the DARPA is the many billion catalyst for creating value through disruption. In Germany, state-funded research institutions like Fraunhofer work collaboratively with companies on incremental innovation projects. I introduced 6 months ago a legislation piece to found a German DARPA for radical innovation. Since then, the key debate is how does this agency fit into the public servant schemes, the pay scales, and the co-determination schemes of Germany. My second reflection, if we talk about beyond market failures, we have to talk about beyond state failures. We simultaneously should debate the failures of state. Now, just to give you a very, very tremendous example from my own country, the energy transition after Fukushima. You might debate right or wrong. You never know when betting on the future. But the execution capability of the bureaucracy and of the state was awful. No mega project management or skills, no interministerial collaboration, no fallback planning. So the state not necessarily is doing good. My third reflection, what is the state? At the end, it's a human organization designed by humans. The skills and competencies and aspirations of the people in the administration, in the political bodies, in the governing roles, in the political parties are crucial. Who is really taking care about talent development in those organizations? who has a clear eye on the competencies, the skills, and the development of individual political talents? Is career in a state a seniority-based development, or is it a horse race, like in the political parties, a social Darwinian selection process? What can politics learn from intelligent corporations in terms of talent management? The more individualized and careful talent management in the public sector is being undertaken, the better it is. The better equipped the administration is with agile collaboration techniques, leadership skills, and a variety of perspectives through cross-mobility, the better is their execution capability. On the other hand, one has to be very careful not to design or copy the French École Nationale Administration with its culture of homosocial reproduction. And still, a key question is open. In this horse race culture of political parties, how can politicians and political talents who have to undertake everything what you say there on your charts, how can they be equipped fast and continuously with some of the competencies needed in managing complexity, in project management, in visioning of technological trends, and so on? A final comment: like business organization, state bodies can experiment and learn in test fields, like Shenzhen in China. So to say, an ambidextrous state. Probably we need to intensify the capability of the state to experiment like private institutions do, though. So let me summarize. Balancing social value creation and technological value creation, reflects skill and skill development for mega projects in the area of the state, talent management in the political arena, and prototyping change initiatives within politics. Smart regulation tested out. Thank you.
So I've known Thomas for a long time. He's never been shy about his opinions. And you're talking about a very ambitious change in the character of the people who populate the state. That's interesting. Mariana.
So when I was writing this book on value, I discovered that sociologists and actually philosophers have been thinking for a long time of the power of language. And there's this concept of performativity, that how you actually judge the performance and measure the performance of things actually also then affects what happens amongst those actors, and then that feeds back into how we theorize, how we talk. So discourse and vocabulary matters a lot. And Plato, by the way, had this wonderful saying. He said that storytellers rule the world. And I want to basically argue that the stories we're telling today and the discourse around the role of the public and the private, which is a really static way of thinking, you know, what is the public's role, what is the private's role, and when is the public sector crowding out the private sector? The BBC gets accused every year of crowding out private broadcasters. That's going to be a really hard framework to get us to be able to do what Hermann very eloquently was talking about at the end of his talk in terms of actually challenging ourselves with the Sustainable Development Goals, which over 100 countries have actually agreed to. How are we going to get there? Well, it's not going to happen through thinking that all we need to do is fix market failures. And so the language, just coming back to this issue of the stories, the discourse, the language, I kind of feel like I'm starting to sound like a postmodernist, matters. And if you just look at these words, which all of us use, even I use them, you know, de-risk, they're really boring, right? So, you know, at best, you set the rules of the game, you do horizontal conditions, framework conditions, you de-risk, I'm talking about what policymakers are told to do, de-risk the private sector, enable, incentivize, facilitate Facilitate is a really problematic word if you think about the difficulties that are ahead. It sounds like you're facilitating those who actually are going to kind of really take on those risks and accept the difficulties. You're just trying to make things easier for them. And this concept of fixing market failures, or at best system failures, it's just kind of, boring. And we shouldn't be surprised then if that also affects the morale, the pay structures, the career structures, the remits of these institutions, which then we love to call a bit boring and dinosaurish and inertial, and hence we need to either outsource or privatize or just do the basics and get out of the way. And I'm not going to go into the whole market failure approach. I assume most of you know it, but it's a powerful approach. It's a strong framework. We shouldn't get rid of it, but it really is. It's a hard framework to use to understand both what's happened in the past as well as, again, the concrete things that have to happen in the future. But especially, again, coming back to language, this idea that you're just fixing, mending, it basically leads to a bandaging approach. So even the different market failures and how we think about them don't get, if you want, lined up. And it also is not unrelated to the underlying theories of value that we have, where we basically, with neoclassical economics, reversed what the classical economists were doing, where they had a strong theory of value that was actually very much positioned and nested in a theory of production. Think of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, his whole concept of the division of labor being kind of central to the understanding of productivity, growth, and again, the wealth of nations. The focus then on prices, so going from a theory of value to a theory of price, which is what they did. What we have today is a theory of price that leads to a theory of value, so what we include in GDP is basically just things with prices, to the point that it becomes much easier for someone like Lloyd Blankfein, 1 year after the crisis, to say that Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. He actually said that, 2009, and it becomes impossible, actually, to talk about government as productive, literally at the accounting level, because we only know how to price the costs, the salaries of the teachers, not the value, the real value of a well-funded, well-structured education system. And again, so it just leads to these kind of narrow ways of thinking, both just fixing, but also how we train civil servants. You were, Thomas, mentioning the importance of how do you actually welcome really high-level talent into the public sector and make it an attractive one. Well, it's quite hard if we basically only teach the really interesting things in MBAs. I mean, just think of the classes: strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. You are explicitly called a wealth creator, a value creator. You're asked, like Steve Jobs said to the Stanford graduating class, to be hungry, be foolish. You almost brag about the failures. You see yourself as a risk taker, so you have to do trial and error and error and error, but then learn from those errors and become a learning organization. We don't have that same kind of ambition when we train civil servants. And this, again, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, a prophecy which we read every week for those of you who are subscribed to The Economist, where the idea is just stick to the basics and then get the hell out of the way. For the revolutionaries, the really cool entrepreneurs, I think, Andrew, are you an entrepreneur? Cool. Like him and Hermann, to do the real stuff. They're going to create value, and at best, the state can redistribute that value through taxation or enable and facilitate it. And it's just a story that so many of us have bought into. And just looking at history, and this is what I did in my book, The Entrepreneurial State, I went sector by sector by sector: biotech, nanotech, internet, and today's emerging clean tech sector. What the state did when it was structured properly, this is not about the DNA of the state or the private sector, when we actually properly organize state structures to be able to welcome risk and experimentation, to be a dynamic partner alongside the private sector throughout the whole innovation chain. This is where I guess Hermann and I a bit differ from you. It's not just about basic research. When the state was most effective, as it was in Silicon Valley, there was basic research, applied research, early stage, high-risk, patient capital, not the VC stuff, which is, 3-year exit-driven cycle where they want to exit through an IPO or a buyout leading to all these plepos in the biotech sector, productless IPOs, it's a great word. What actually we required to get these big general purpose technologies was much more ambition than just that. And in fact, I often talk to Hermann about his own first company, Acorn, how it actually wouldn't have happened without, for example, the procurement policy. So also government as dynamic purchaser, which the BBC played in the UK when it had its learning program and wanted all kids to code, and they had to build that microcomputer, which then both Acorn and ARM dynamically interacted with. So if it's not going to help us explain the GPTs, it sure as hell won't help us get us the SDGs. That rhymes, so I love saying it. And you know, again, we're talking about specific organizations. So people like to mention DARPA, but you know, there's DARPA, there's ARPA-E, there was the NSF. In other parts of the world, there was YASMA in Israel, again, providing that patient long-term capital. Some public banks have also been structured really ambitiously. Not the one in Italy, I'm from Italy, so the Italian public bank has just been about subsidies and guarantees and basically just fortifying what I would call a parasitic public-private ecosystem, not a symbiotic one, where at best the state is saying, what do you need? And of course, you know, when business is asked what it needs, it doesn't necessarily lead to the most ambitious kinds of investments and co-investments. And so all the different things that actually got us the smart things in your iPhones, from, you know, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, actually came out of particular organizational structures, which we're also seeing today in places like ARPA-E, where Cheryl Martin, the second director, said that actually how they measured success was by how much risk they were willing to take, and also how much then economy-wide impact their successes had. But you have to take risks. So also NIH, you know, is a particular type of organization. 75% of the research, both basic and applied in the blockbuster drugs, comes out of that kind of public funding. And today, again, in the clean tech sector, that upper right-hand quadrant, the high-risk, high capital-intensive area is, in fact, being absorbed by different types of public entities around the world, but we have no idea how to talk about it. And again, what would it mean then to talk about these things differently? It means both training people differently, and that's why I set up this Institute for Public Purpose at UCL, but also literally just thinking about a more co-creation, co-shaping agenda, not just a fixing one. But that really does also have to lead to new ways to evaluate. So we're working very closely with the Treasury in the UK and basically saying, look, a net present value calculation or cost-benefit analysis would have stopped the moonshot from day one. And my last 60 seconds, since Hermann went over by 60 seconds, I will too, was, you know, what I actually tried to do with the commission was to really reflect on that moonshot. The moonshot, of course, is different from these social, more wicked problems, but what got us to the moon was government actually being able to set a very concrete task, get to the moon and back again in one generation. It was inspirational. I got kids in schools to dream. And then what got us there was lots of different sectors innovating, investing. Today we have record level hoarding. We have record level financialization. We needed investment in innovation, not just in aeronautics, but also in nutrition, in textiles. And so what would that look like if we actually applied that really to the SDGs, turning them from challenges to missions, and instead of just talking about the problems of, you know, dirty oceans or dirty air, clean growth, and the future of health and future mobility, turn them into moonshots. But this really requires thinking through the instruments we currently have. What would it look to transform procurement policy, to really be, you know, trying to drive and crowd in that bottom-up exploration and experimentation, to use prize schemes to do that, and to, you know, admit that most of these projects that got us to the moon actually failed. So what does that mean for how we evaluate these dynamic spillovers that happen along the way, some of the successes, but also that necessary risk-taking process? It's hard. And sorry, that's why I wrote these books, and you can go buy them. This is a self-promotional slide. But also, we absolutely need to really think through the training, the way that we not just talk, but how we need to be just as ambitious with public servants as we are with great MBA students, of which I'm sure there's many here in the room.
Okay, thanks, Mariana. So there almost seems to be a momentum building towards a much more activist or involved state, very different people operating. Martin, do you agree with that? Is that where are you, what's your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I was pretty sure that by the time it got to me that people would be, have been informed by immensely knowledgeable people how the state can operate in promoting innovation. There will be some different views on how that works, and it would be completely foolish for me to compete with them. So I'm going to take a somewhat different and much broader approach. And my basic point is fairly simple. The state is the most important institutional innovation in human history. It is as essential now as it's ever been. And the idea that we would all be in heaven if it only got out of the way is only possible for people who are so used to strong and powerful states that they cannot imagine their disappearance. So what I'm including people interested in business, need to focus on is how to make states work better. That raises so many issues that I can't go into, but what I'm going to do is at least try and explain why what I've said is, in my view, correct, and what that seems to me to imply in terms of immediate challenges. So what I'm going to do is divide my remarks into three parts. I'm just going to start off with a very brief discussion of value to get that out of the way. The second is most important is on what is the economic role the state actually does play. And finally, what should be the priorities be for states operating in high-income countries. I don't have the time to go into the development, the issues of development. Now, as Mariana has already hinted at, there has been a very long effort by economists to define value and to measure value. These have been tremendously influential, of course, particularly as she mentioned, GDP accounting. What isn't measured doesn't count, so that's obviously true in this case. But I'm going to try and finesse this. I'm not going to go into all the problems and difficulties with standard value theory, except to note that however we account it, we know that even in the purest theory, price does not equal value. So it's a pretty fundamental issue. If you want to have any question about that, just think about water for a few seconds. But for the purpose of this discussion, all I want to say is I will define economic value as something that contributes to the economic flourishing of a population, and by that I mean, quite simply, widely shared and sustainable prosperity. And if you don't know what prosperity is, you shouldn't be in business. So that's my definition of value. So what economic role does the state actually play? Now, I've got a list of 10 things it does. I could add to it, but this will do. First, the state provides collective and individual security. That's why it was created. It supplies, as a result, the judicial system. It underpins and has always underpinned the monetary system. A non-state monetary system is an illusion. It creates human capital. It is far and away the most important institution creating human capital, both directly and indirectly. It regulates and controls the borders, including the economic borders of countries. Indeed, by definition, it defines what a country is. It finances and directs innovation and has always done so. There's nothing new about this. It regulates and guides economic activity in innumerable ways and has always done so. It is the prime institution responsible for protecting the commons, the environmental commons. It, of course, is enjoined and required to cooperate with other governments to create any working system of global governance. And, of course, finally and crucially, among all these activities, it establishes the laws that govern the roles, purposes, and legitimate operation of all businesses. And if all that isn't important, I don't know what is, and I don't know what the world would look like if all this disappeared, but I suggest you think about it. States, of course, emerged together with the agrarian revolution, and that wasn't an accident. Any modestly complex economy needs a powerful state to underpin it. Any modestly complex economy will also provide, one hopes, if it works, the resources needed to support it. That has not always worked, whereupon we have state collapse. Today's states are, of course, far and away the biggest and most complex in human history, because our economies are the biggest and most complex in human histories. Indeed, they're probably, not probably, certainly the first states in human history that can and do govern societies in detail. States have frequently failed in the past to fulfill their core functions in whole or in part because of some mixture of underlying fragility, incompetence, corruption, or outright capture, permanent threats. What do we want, finally, the states to do now? These are, I think, the priorities for our states. Improve opportunity for all our populations, provide better economic stability. Big financial crises are very bad news. Enhance competition, promote innovation, and manage the environment. To achieve these things, states will have to be really quite active. They need to rethink the tax system, total mess. They need to rethink the monetary system, also, by the way, a total mess. They need to rethink the financial system, ditto. They need to rethink how the welfare state operates in its relationship to the labor market. They need to comprehensively rethink competition policy, which has allowed the emergence of pervasive monopoly. They need to rethink the law governing the goals of companies, which is also a total mess. And not least, they have to cooperate among themselves far more intensely, precisely at the point in world history because of past failures, nationalism and inward-looking approaches are rising. We have the most global economy in world history, and we are right in the process of de-globalizing because of the rise of nationalism. And that's, in my view, the fundamental crisis. My 5 most important conclusions. Economic value should be defined as broadly shared and sustainable prosperity, number 1. Number 2, the state is the indispensable institution if this is to be achieved. It isn't outside the market. It shapes everything that makes a market economy work. If the state is to deliver what we want, it must be ambitious, effective, and in my view, under democratic control. And if anybody thinks we've got all these 3 things right at the moment, I think they have to think again. States have to cooperate with other states. In a world in which that happens, our entire economic and environmental systems will collapse. And the question, to my mind, the core question, is whether humanity is capable in this time of achieving any of that. And if it doesn't, go back to Hermann Hauser's wonderful introduction, all those brave new technologies will, in my view, destroy us.
Martin, thank you. I'm glad you're willing to share some opinions. And it's great. Andrew, you've talked about the future being, well, you've talked about the present being broken and the future in need of being fixed.
Yeah, it's a bit daunting to go after Martin. I'm embarrassing. And we found that we grew up on the same street in North London. Some of you may have read his piece in the Financial Times. He's gone to South London, so I don't know that's his only problem. He's a brilliant economist. But we did grow up on Thornton Way in Hampstead Garden suburb, so I hope some of his wisdom has trickled down the road. Is anyone else here from Thornton Way? I don't think so. What would that mean, Martin, for economists, if everyone here was from Thornton Way? So I think Martin summed it up. I mean, it's kind of a stupid question, how the state creates value. It's a dumb question. That is the central question in the history of humanity. And I don't quite know what I can add to what Martin and Mariana and everybody else said. Let me try and be a little maybe historical. We're in Vienna, city of history, so maybe there's a kind of a historical angle here. It was, remember, the third man. You remember the famous moment in The Third Man, Orson Welles on the merry-go-round, where he talks about morality and the Swiss and the Borgias, and reminds everyone, I think, as Martin suggested, that the value of the state is creating morality and creating order in underpinning humanism, underpinning or giving value to humanity. So that's the key question. It's always been the key question. And it's always been the great debate of any age. When The Third Man was made, of course, after the Second World War in the 1940s, and I don't know when the movie was made, but it was situated in Vienna, where there was a great debate going on between East and West about how the state creates value. So the question is not whether the state creates value, it's how it creates value. In the 20th century, the debate was between two kinds of states, two kinds of political economic systems, the Soviet system and the Western system. And of course, Vienna was a kind of a platform, to borrow some language from Mariana, if you like, a narrative, the stage of this great debate. That's what The Third Man was about. We know what happened in that story. We know how it ended. It was self-evident that the Western model worked and the Soviet model didn't. The Soviet model was inefficient, it was unjust, it was loathed by its population, and in 1989 it collapsed. So some people, we all know the famous Fukuyama argument that this represented the end of history, but as always, of course, it didn't represent the end of history. The end of one debate creates the foundation for another debate. And in the 21st century, we have a new debate about how the state creates value. We have to historicize this. It's not enough to speak in abstract terms. We have to, I think, recognize that there are three kinds of states emerging. So the argument is not a bipolar argument. It's one between three parties. And I think particularly the third party hasn't been mentioned here, which is rather chilling in my view. And of course, this debate, this 21st century conversation about how the state creates value needs to be understood in the context of Hermann's introduction about all these new technologies. AI in particular, and the core issue in AI, as I think as Martin suggested, is one of agency. We've created technology that replicates human agency, that might indeed be our last invention, that certainly undermines us, our power. So, as Martin suggested, in this age of these increasingly intrusive and ubiquitous technologies, the role of the state becomes even more critical. So what are the three models? The one that hasn't been mentioned, which troubles me, is the Chinese model. A model in which the state creates all value but extinguishes democracy. A model of not necessarily surveillance capitalism, but surveillance of authoritarianism, a kind of updated version of Orwell's 1984, but much more efficient. What the Chinese are pioneering, especially with their social capital schemes, is an all-inclusive state that does everything, that does away with politics, that does away with democracy, but also guarantees economic prosperity. That is the model which is so chilling in my view. It's particularly chilling not only because of its absence of morality, but because it seems to be working. The second model is, of course, the American model, where I'm from. I just had an argument with my son. In the recent fires in California, the wealthy people of Southern California were able to hire private firefighters, and their homes were saved, whereas the poor people down in Southern California burnt up. That is the essential anecdote about the American model, the dysfunctionality, the disappearance, the retreat of the state. That explains the Silicon Valley model. That explains why San Francisco, where I'm from, is quite literally the city of shit. Everywhere you go, there's shit on the pavements. I don't know if you're allowed to say that here? because the state has retreated, because it doesn't exist. That's the model of the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, Bill's relative, who says we don't need the state. You don't need the state if you live in gated communities. You don't need the state if you retreat into a kind of digital feudalism. So that's the second model, the opposite of the Chinese model. It's one where you have a kind of rampant plebiscitary democracy. We know the outcome, or we know one of the outcomes, which is emerging in the United States. It certainly reflects a prosperous economic development, a degree of vitality, of innovation, of all these cult words that Mariana talked about. So that's the second model. And the third model, since we're in Europe, is of course the European model, which is a mixture of the two, which is an attempt to combine the best elements of the Chinese model in terms of some sort of authoritative, redistributive state, and the American model of economic vitality married to democracy. The problem, of course, with the European model is it doesn't seem to work in either senses. That's unkind, but perhaps true. So none of these models, in my view, at the moment work. The American model results in a city of shit. The Chinese model returns us to Orwell. The European model is a model in which there's very little economic innovation, very few unicorns. So we need to work perhaps on a fourth model. It's particularly important. What I would say is ultimately the role of the state in the age of AI, in the age of blockchain, in the age of all these increasingly disruptive technologies, the role of the state is to protect and encourage human agency. The role of the state is empowering us. The great question of our age is, what is our place? What is our role? Are we a footnote? Are we victims of AI? Are we victims of this digital revolution? So the great challenge as this debate unfolds is placing us. It's really, this conversation about how the state creates value is really a conversation about humanity and trying to figure out a humanism which will be triggered and protected by the state for a networked age. So I don't have the answers, but there are lots of problems. Thank you.
So thank you, Andrew. We have 20 minutes to solve your questions and solve your problems. So before we start, I'm wondering to my fellow panel members, did you hear anything that you want to respond to? Or Mariana, you're nodding instantly. It's an open invitation. I'm going to start with Mariana. Open invitation. Did you hear something that somebody else said that you want to talk about a little bit more, either for, against, or engaging?
Just one thing I think that none of us mentioned, and it reminded me when Andrew mentioned, actually both Martin and Andrew mentioned, will AI and will the robots kind of take over? That's an old question. That's a question that goes back 200 years. So David Ricardo was already talking about that in chapter 31 of his Principles of Political Economy. He had a chapter called On Machinery, where he's like, all this mechanization that was happening then is taking over jobs, it is reducing wages. But then what happened for 200 years is the profits were reinvested back in the system. And that often was also due to the role that the state played as a healthy, tense partner. So for example, Bell Labs that everyone knows about because it was one of the most innovative R&D laboratories in the private sector actually came about in a period that the state was much more confident than it is today and forced a monopoly at the time, AT&T, to reinvest its profits into the real economy, innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. So that was a healthy deal. And in a world where we have $2 trillion being hoarded in the US, an equivalent amount in Europe, and $3 trillion in the last 10 years being spent on share buybacks, that's a bad deal. That level, that lack of reinvestment and the ultra-financialization of the economy, which is the current context we're living in, is due to the state also no longer being kind of a healthy partner. And I do think that also comes back to this kind of lack of security and confidence, and we could go back into those words. But I don't buy this whole AI is going to take over. We allow it to take over when we lose that agency and when it becomes a really boring marriage.
Okay, Thomas, you had your hand up?
Well, I just realized we all forgot about a key actor, the normal citizen. What are the people desiring? Is then the state the servant of the people? Is the state the moral educator of the people? Is the state the liberator of the people? So state somehow is resonating in what do the people want. And if we look around to France, to Italy, to the US, you cannot dissociate the discussion about the state from the sentiment of the people. Point.
Okay, okay. Martin? Martin?
Perhaps my comment will fit the two together. I think if we're going to start talking about politics, which in the time available we haven't really been able to do, it's pretty obvious, as I suggested, Andrew suggested, you just raised, that a very significant proportion, and it fits with what Mariana said, a very significant proportion of our populations feel pretty discontented with what has been happening. There is a huge debate, I'm involved in writing a book on this at the moment, about how far this is economic and how far this is broader cultural change. And I'm not going to go into that in detail except to say that it seems pretty clear to me that economics is a fairly big part of this. And I do think that, while I agree with Mariana that it is possible to imagine the evolution of our economies working in such a way that they will benefit all our citizens, it's pretty obvious that we're operating under very severe headwinds. And of the two, I don't think that the technological change is the only one, though it's clearly been a very important one. But I would stress something very important, which has two edges to it. Through the process of industrialization from the early 19th century to about 40 years ago, essentially the Western world had a monopoly of the know-how to do this. They had a monopoly of the know-how to do this, and they developed political systems by the middle of the 20th century to share the gains out, political and social systems, unions, to share the gains out among themselves. The most important economic development of the last 40 years, in my view, is not technology, but simply the fact that the West has definitively lost this monopoly. And that isn't reversible. And it's true, and it's not about imports from China, it's about the fact that they're competing, and other countries will, India, to compete with us. We haven't adapted to this at all. And the symptoms of our failure to adapt, in my view, is one of the symptoms of our failure to adapt is the rise of nationalism, which will make everything worse, in my view. But it's clear that there are some pretty big economic forces causing us trouble. It's a big part of our problem, and we really, on the whole, have not done a good job of managing them.
Good. Thank you. Herman, I'm going to ask you, and then Andrew, okay?
Yes, I want to make two quick comments, one on Europe and one on human agency. I thought Andrew's depiction of the three systems that we have at the moment, a very liberal US, a very dictatorial China, and the sort of in-between system in Europe is an interesting and correct one. But I'm actually very proud of what we've achieved in Europe, because we're the only area that we're willing and capable of creating a governance layer above the nation state. With all its flaws and all the problems that we have at the moment, especially with Brexit, there is still a cohesion across across nations that does not exist anywhere else in the world, and I'm very proud of this.
Okay, thank you. Andrew?
No, I do have...
All right, yeah,
my second point is on human agency. There's a lot of talk about human agency. Now, because of AI, and there's a lot of talk about AI, we are actually giving up some of the lower levels of human agency. And autonomous cars are a good example of that. We are actually entrusting, I put it to you, entrusting our future transport to autonomous systems. And our expectation is that they will probably cause 90% less accidents. Now, is this a bad thing? Because humans are actually not very good drivers. So we're giving up things to autonomous systems that we were very proud of as something that we did ourselves. And I think in the case, there's a lot of worry about AIs taking over. Am I particularly worried that AIs are taking over driving cars if they're safer, if they can transport our old people and our children to school in a much safer way? No, the first step into AI, it doesn't look so bad to me.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Andrew.
So I think one of the assumptions on this panel is that the Western sort of state's in a crisis. But in my book, which is available outside, How to Fix the Future, there are models of Western democratic states that are working. I have a chapter in my book on Estonia and one on Singapore. And what defines Estonia and Singapore is the fact, and maybe Israel as well, I don't write about Israel, that these are states that are truly revolutionary. They begin with a kind of year zero. And what distinguishes Estonia and Singapore from the Western models, the UK, and certainly the UK and the US, is the trust people have in the state. That's the great question. That comes back to the question of, well, what do we do for the citizens? The great question of our age is, how do we rebuild trust in state? How do we rebuild trust in authority? Now, Hermann wants to go up here. He says, well, maybe the traditional state's in crisis, but we can have this superstate, the EU. I'm not convinced by that. I think that actually undermines many of the values of democracy and of the state. I would rather go down a level. I think we need to rethink the very idea of the state and use models like Estonia and particularly Singapore, the kind of city-state model, to rethink where authority lies and what the political relationships are in the networked age. We talked about self-driving cars. One of the most interesting developments is smart cities. Now, I know this kind of sounds very sexy and silly, but within the seeds of smart cities can, and this goes back to the third man and the Renaissance and blah, 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 represents, I think, an opportunity for cities to reinvigorate themselves. And even in the US, you have cities as the real, maybe not San Francisco, but some other cities, Los Angeles, interestingly, as places of enlightenment and the rebuilding of authority. So rather going up to superstates, I think we need to look at the local level, and that's where the state can be rebuilt, and that's where we can reestablish trust, authority, which, as Martin suggested, is the key issue of our age, given the rise of populism and hatred of all forms of authority.
So we have 10 minutes, and we're getting questions from the audience, and if I combine those with what I'm hearing now, I wonder if each of you could give us just very briefly what you think the next steps are. How do you regain trust? Do we need new institutions? How do we change the relationship of the citizen? Are there any thoughts about how to do that? Mariana?
Well, one interesting thing with this moonshot example is that there's two different ways to do it. One is the kind of Kennedy super top-down thing. As inspirational as that was, it was very top-down, and it's not really the model, I think, that we're thinking about. The other one is, and I know there's lots of controversy around it, but in Germany, the Energiewende mission, forget about some of the critiques on the renewable energy policy, but what it basically was a massive, or is, because it's being carried out, transformation in a green direction of the whole manufacturing sector. So steel, the steel sector in Germany, unlike basically in most other parts of Europe and the world, has lowered its material content. And the idea is, to do that across manufacturing. And it would not have happened without that kind of state set, if you want, mission. However, where that came from was decades of the green movement. There was a movement that kind of put pressure and built the legitimacy in society that this mattered. And I think that's where the tension is and what we can learn from. What does it mean to actually both say that we are going to have a clear mission that requires that cross-sectoral investment? It has to be top-down, otherwise where is it going to come from? But it actually comes from listening and having empathy serious empathy. Empathy is an art. You don't just have it. So listening to the movements, including the ones around care, there's huge controversies and discussions and debates around the future of healthcare, not just about sort of medicines, but how we devise a proper healthcare system with nurses on the front line battling for this. You know, what would it mean to listen to nurses, to listen to people who are fighting for that? And that means knowing how to deal with conflict. There's conflict. We shouldn't forget that we all have the weekend and an 8-hour workday because trade unions fought for that. You know, they fought, people died. So lots of these benefits that have actually co-created and co-shaped markets, as I was talking about before, required people putting themselves on the line, and the degree to which, you know, states and democratic societies can hear the voices but then transform them into missions, I think is one of the ways that citizen engagement can be, you know, sort of a key part of that in a non-tokenistic way.
Good. Martin?
I gave quite a few answers on things that I think we should look at, but so I won't go over those again. I'd like to make 2 points which don't answer the question because it's just too big. First, I know Singapore fairly well, and it works very well, but I regard it as a benevolent autocracy, not a democracy. And maybe that's the point. They have eliminated electoral competition. And this is my second big point. It's where I'm going to push back against Hermann fairly strongly. Okay, over time, we have turned democratic politics increasingly into a business. And people who understand how manipulable human beings en masse are dominate political campaigns. And which makes it impossible for them to operate in any sort of traditional theoretical notion of a genuine debate and discussion among well-informed citizens. Isn't it plausible, I would ask, that AI isn't just going to help us drive our cars, it's going to help manipulative people to drive our politics? And isn't that actually already happening? And doesn't that mean, and it will get much worse, because the people running the machines will know everything about every one of us. Everything about every one of us. At the end of which democracy is over, and maybe we will have to retreat to Singaporean benevolent autocracy. And that my final comment on that is, we've had a long experience of autocracy in world history. And the problem is it's an extreme variance system, which is for every one benevolent autocracy, you can get 99 horrors. And for this reason, I'm passionately keen on democracy, and I'm passionately frightened of what the manipulation of democracy now happening is leading us to. And I'm sorry, to me, the computer age in its modern form is very much part of the problem.
Okay. Let me go ahead. Okay. Andrew, some thoughts?
Why do I always have to go after Martin?
It's alphabetical order.
Yes, because you were 3, Thornton Way, and I was 17. And I'm your junior, as you reminded me earlier. I couldn't agree more, as always. Who would ever dare to disagree with Martin? I couldn't agree more with Martin on this.
You should meet my wife.
Is that an invitation? What's important and what's interesting to know, actually, to add to Martin's fear, is I've raised the specter of the Chinese model. Of course, in the US model is a kind of surveillance capitalism. I've written 4 books about the dangers of the surveillance capitalism engineered and pioneered by the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, a data capitalism. So that's another danger. We can't blame everything on the Chinese. In terms of solutions, I think you're right on Singapore. You've convinced me that I shouldn't probably use Singapore. But Estonia still is. Do you think Estonia is viable as a model? I mean, we have to be positive, Martin. We can't just give up. What I would do, in terms of a solution, I have in my book what I call Moore's Law. It's not Gordon Moore of Intel, it's Thomas More. I reread Utopia. And what I found from Moore's Utopia, written 500 years ago, was again another eternal lesson. The technology is different, but the debate is still the same about the role of the state and the role of citizenship. And what Moore was reminding us of 500 years ago, in the midst of even bigger disruption than we're going through today, was the role of human agency. And his enemy, of course, was Martin Luther and Luther's notion of predestination, the idea we weren't empowered. The issue then is one of citizenship, but it can't be a trickle-down citizenship. My sort of reading or my development of what I call Moore's Law, Thomas Moore's Law in my book, suggests that citizens need to become more responsible. It's not just enough to wait for government. It's not enough to wait for entrepreneurs. It's not enough to wait for educators. Citizens also need to move forward and to somehow re-embrace this ideal of citizenship and take responsibility for fashioning their society. Because if you point to others, if you blame others, as Moore warned in Utopia and many other writers have warned, then, as Martin suggested, we really are doomed, particularly in the midst of all these new surveillance technologies, whether they're state-based or market-based, which undermine not only our freedom, but our essence as human beings. Because the danger of this new technology is it does away with secrecy. It sees inside us. It does away with the core element, the core vehicle of all of our achievements over the last 300 years of guaranteeing individual freedom. This technology looks inside us, it knows who we are, it knows what we're thinking, it knows what we will think before we do. And we need, again, to come up with new definitions of citizenship and individual rights, because otherwise we really are, as Martin suggests, we really are doomed as a species.
Okay. Thomas, we have 1 minute. Do you have a response from the political side?
I just thought about why the Chinese try to do everything that the events in the place of heavenly peace are being forgotten. And the role of history and the role of knowing about the past is so relevant to create the future. So that was one of my reflections I had up here, and coming from a country which made the Holocaust, the culture of forgetting, or to a culture of awareness, is a key issue for a vivid democracy. So probably I would advocate now in the first point for the role of history and for the role of challenging yourself with the history. Okay. 3 pragmatic advices. I fully share the view of Andrew. We have to empower villages, rural regions, smart cities, whatsoever. Politics has to become visible again. Secondly, agile methods have to come into politics so that we can move. And thirdly, we have to invest into administrative and political talent.
So I have to tell you that we're going to end now because it's right on time. Hermann is going to leave this room unhappy because he disagrees violently.
One sentence.
Oh, okay. Great.
I just have one sentence. I completely disagree with Martin and Andrew. Computers are not just part of the problem, they're also part of the solution.
And with that, will you join me in thanking the panel?
Thank you. Thank you.